Great to hear from you all. And I'm looking forward to this. I've been looking forward to this discussion, and we're going to kick it off in just a minute because of all of this. So what you started to note there is really the emphasis on the land managers, on the people and communities that are part of that durable solution, delivering them short-term outcomes as well as counting on them for long-term durable outcomes as well, so that they have that opportunity to meet a meaningful livelihood that supports the decisions and choices they need to make for their families and their communities. So it's exciting to begin to consider what that actually means. I'm going to share my screen quickly because we have a few questions, and I see that we have some questions in the chat as well that have come up, and I'll redirect those in just a second. But to kick us off, I wanted to ask a question back to you as you guys have wrapped up, Arnaud and Matthew, from the Viridian perspectives, and kind of dive in a little bit more because you touched on a number of these points in terms of project setup and seeing commercial viability. But could you dive a little bit deeper on like what it takes to develop a commercially viable AAR project and what you're learning in these new contexts, even working with Nuru or in your own experiences?
Definitely. Arnaud, could you start us off and then I'll get into the details?
Certainly. Our first assessment really is on the ground. We like to work with our partners, get on the ground, understand local dynamics, what the framework is, everything covering from productivity of a site, soil types, native species, the availability of native species, from a seed and seedling production point of view, through assessing the strength of the supply chain, through to understanding how to create a pathway that allows us to secure capital in order to fund the work. As I said, across an array of different types of capital.
Yeah, thanks, Arnaud. And there's really 4 pillars that we want to think about when we set up these projects. To Arnaud's point, it's why now? Why is this relevant effectively? We try to look at the local context from a policy perspective and then break down every element all the way down to the local user to make sure there's actually a pathway to implementing a project. So, what is the feasibility? What is the local acceptance? And what is the local understanding? And could it be catalytic if we demonstrated a successful project? Then, of course, we need to know that there's finance and financiers that could be attracted to these types of projects. So we look at market conditions, where transactions are happening, who's willing to invest or purchase offtakes from these projects and map that. And then, of course, there's all the nuanced details like pilot design. And this is what Arnaud was referring to in breaking down the supply chain, making sure there's a local pathway to actually implementing the projects. And finally, there's the local agents. Who is going to establish these programs and be responsible from implementation to coordinating the financing, being a responsible party, all the way to developing the systems for measurement, reporting, and verification, because these projects all are multi-year, if not multi-decadal. So we need to make sure there's the durability of stakeholders over that time period. And of course, when we get into the very specific detail, we're breaking down everything from species mix to who are the farmers that are going to be participating in it, looking at landscape analysis, doing things like nursery planning, mapping a supply chain, understanding costs along the way, because ultimately what we're trying to create is a financially viable model. So if we understand all our inputs and if we can procure those incentives for all of those inputs, because of course, no one's going to do this for free. We want to make sure that all those costs can be baked into the cost of the good that we are selling, whether that's a hybrid between the commodity and the offtake or simply just the offtake agreement. And that's ultimately what we're working towards. It's something that is viable and that can be translated back to creating patience among the participants. Because again, when we have that seasonality lost upon us, we have to wait 5 years, 10 years for benefit. Is there a way to make sure that incentive captures that timeline between project development and project realization?
I want to speak, Matthew, to the importance of our stakeholders on the ground. We don't profess to know much. We're in the United States. We do know how to develop these projects, but the selection of partners on the ground to implement the work, not just in the short term, but long term, will inspire confidence in the investors and stakeholders that we bring to the table, as well as those long-term offtakes, and that to develop credibility of this market that remains still nascent.
No, thank you both very much. Yeah, that development of the supply chain, identifying seed supply, other input supply, being able to make sure that can reach these communities in rural areas. That's been a crucial lesson learned for us in agricultural value chains over many years at Nuru. In my experience over the last 15, I'm working on these types of agricultural development projects, but also this last 5 years entering into the NBS space. So it's a really good lesson learned of like, how do we sustain those projects over time? How does nursery management and nursery access equate to effectiveness in terms of transplanting and so on? So really good lessons there. James, I wanted to jump to you real quick and bring it back to you. I'm going to jump around on the questions and then I'm going to get to the chat because I am monitoring it. And I can see that we've started to answer, even with some of this discussion and presentation, a few of the questions there. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. I haven't forgotten about it. But James, you mentioned a number, excuse me, a number of different sort of standards and certifications and entities and interested parties in your project in Ghana, in the cocoa value chain. How are you seeing standards fatigue amongst the farmers, amongst the farmer groups manifesting on the ground? Are they acting as more of a barrier to adoption of new practices or an incentive? And what's it really come down to, getting to Margaret Anderson's question in the chat and what was already alluded to by Matthew and Arnaud? What does it take to get farmers to adopt risky new practices in your experience? So is that fatigue there? Are you seeing it? And how do you overcome potentially, as I'm alluding to, that barrier?
Yeah, definitely there are fatigues there. So you see some farmers reluctant to switch to other practices because they have been switching. They started planting shade-loving cocoa. They said, oh, go to sun-loving, they cut, or they invest in sun-loving, and now shade-loving cocoa. So it's a fatigue, like this one comes, the next day the other comes. And it's showing in some farmers very reluctant to adapt. They want to keep to their own farming practices, and they will tell you, oh, this came 10 years ago and it's gone, and we will revert back to that. So it's showing on them. Again, it's showing because some farmers adapted organic cocoa farming. And recently when we engage them, they tell us that they produce organic cocoa beans and only about 20% is bought. The rest, they have to sell it as conventional. So this is definitely not encouraging them to adapt this. So the market is one of them, the cleaning of practices, the inputs, and if there's no extension services to support that, they are reluctant to. So all these things must be there. Climate smart cocoa standard that we are implementing is because it's coming from the states, and there's a lot of incentive on that. And also the premium on that is also coming. Some companies started implementing that, and so they see how farmers who subscribe to that are benefiting. And it's like seeing is believing. So once they see the benefit coming, they also believe and switch. In this sense, we're trying to set up demonstration farms. So they must see visibly increase in production, access to market, and then the benefits.
Thank you, James. Yeah, you highlighted some key points around the importance of technical assistance, which has shined through in a number of recent bodies of research that have been published, even one by ISF advisors on agri-food systems. Excuse me. And blended finance, which is also one of the key areas of improving kind of blended finance effectiveness, is really investing in technical assistance more deeply. You referenced a few specific examples of how that would work in your experience. It's really helpful. I've done it with the last 12 minutes. I'm going to start in on the chat. Because this is a smaller group of about 30 of us, I'm going to open up the airwaves, so to speak. If anyone would like to come off mute and ask your question, if it hasn't been answered, or if it's evolved a little bit since you asked it, Amy, Margaret, Mark, you're welcome to ask your question to the group and direct it at either presenter. Feel free. You can raise your hand if you're more comfortable and we can call on you. Thank you. Go ahead, Mark. See your hand up.
Initial reactions to that was the Proforest presentation was interesting, and also the collection of coalition or consortium partners. And I guess when Matthew and Arnaud were saying about learning about what works on the ground, I just wonder how much learning has been extracted from that whole consortium. I appreciate that some of these things are at an early stage, like James was mentioning about regenerative agriculture just starting off, but I think there's probably learning that you can already extract in terms of the structures that were put in place, the partnerships, the roles, the cost of those things. Because in the end, you're trying to find an efficient model, aren't you? Otherwise, there won't be enough incentives flowing right through the model and certainly not down to the farmers. And that's been a regular critique, hasn't it? That, these models, they gobble up money elsewhere, but they don't deliver enough down at the farm level. So I just wonder whether there could be some more deliberate learning in Ghana itself about those things.
I think this question is towards me. So yeah, we are documenting our lessons and experiences very well. It took us a lot of time to set up the governance structure, and we have documented the steps and the challenges, and if somebody wants to adapt it, how it can be adapted. Maybe we can share with you later on. And then we are currently documenting the lessons and experience with the restoration activities we are doing, especially in the protected areas. There are several models we are piloting, and we're learning lessons as we move along. And also, like what Arnaud and Matthew said, how do you set up a dynamic agroforestry system? What we went through, and even selection of the species, some of the species, and local knowledge. Local knowledge is very important, how we documenting all this. And so when they are ready, we can share that one also with you. We also documenting lessons on livelihood diversification, how we are using village savings and loan system, and also how we developing livelihoods on the challenges we are facing. So there's a lot of lessons we are learning on that.
Yeah. And Mark, I'll just add to that as a great call out. There are multiple pillars that we go to for knowledge repositories. One of them is obviously academic literature and standards that are coming from global shops. We want to make sure that any sort of case studies that have been unpacked or like publicly available data through these academic sources is brought in as a first superficial scan of kind of opportunities to conduct the work. The rest of that really needs to be coming from local environments. And in our case, when we come into these systems, the reason we are static on having local partners, local on the ground partners, whenever we can, is because there are ways to capture that knowledge through case studies, repositories, lessons learned, not only in this particular space, but in parallel sector. There is no reason why we couldn't look to agriculture and any sort of commercial activity that's been spun up there to inform forestry practice, or simply to look at previous resource extraction economies or existing resource extraction economy and derive information from them to permute to a model that would work for us in these particular systems. In fact, that is the basis of how we do this in many other markets around the world. In the Western US, a very comfortable example for us, where we don't have confidence in case studies and examples of how nature-based solutions are being developed in a highly visible market, we turn to the traditional forest economy for costing, for pricing, for understanding supply chains and regulatory mechanisms. And we work with that as a foundation to permute towards the future model that we'll be implementing. And I don't see why we wouldn't do the same in every other geography that we work into.
Yeah, thank you all.
You called out also. Oh, sorry. No, I was going to say, Mark rightfully called out the importance of those dollars, if you will, flowing through to the local community. And that's really of paramount importance, and why we speak about the need for catalytic capital up front in order to get the wheels moving and to ultimately deliver successful models that we can replicate at scale. Because ultimately the whole point of this is to build multiple income streams for local communities where we can, of course, beyond that, have an environmental impact. And if we don't impact those communities financially, then the flywheel just, it won't go.
And I'll just add one thing. I mean, from the AMEA perspective as well, one of the challenges we've even learned through the network, right, Mark, is data sharing can be a challenge, especially when it comes to Agri-SME finances and other forms of income measurement in terms of impact of specific activities on community members and land managers. I think improving that area of learning and sharing is something that is really important. Continuing these conversations about how we increase income per hectare and how we measure that, both from these various forms of revenue streams that are coming into a place and how we pool capital into places where communities are managing resources with multiple socio-environmental returns, as well as the economic return, becomes a really important exercise in assessing the quality of these projects on the ground, not just in terms of carbon sequestered or in terms of other sort of outcomes, but in terms of the income, the diversified income generated, and then the general satisfaction, the qualitative side, right? Amongst the membership in the community and within the Agri-SME cooperative or community-based natural resource management entity that's trying to benefit from these projects. So that's an area we won't have time today, but really with this AMEA environmental working group, I want to continue that conversation and continue to bring partners to it so that we can move it forward, especially where other networks globally, other coalitions and networks are also having those conversations. Because that's the only way we're going to accelerate this process of knowing what's going on essentially on the ground more broadly. Margaret, I'm going to give you the last question with 3 minutes left. Please feel free. And we may not get to the answer, but we'll be able to all connect afterwards. So Margaret, please.
Thanks, Casey. That feels like a lot of pressure to have the final question, but I just wanted to follow up on Mark's point about knowledge and your point about information sharing. I'm curious on this question of farmers adopting new practices. Do we have from Ghana specifically because of the Proforest example shared today, something like return on investment information or something like case studies, business case studies about the benefits for farmers to adopt the regenerative ag practices or agroforestry? I know it can vary a lot, but I just wondered if there was specific information about those examples. Thank you.
James, did you want to, or Matthew, I have one example too. I can give. Nestle has recently published research on their income incubator accelerator, which is a great example, Margaret, of them actually quantifying the income impact for smallholder farmers adopting improved cocoa production practices. That's just one from a separate external partner that we've reviewed. So I'll pause there, just giving an example quickly. James or Matthew or Arnaud, anything else to share from case studies or examples you reviewed or experience?
I'll reinforce that this is actually one of the most fundamental challenges in an emerging market like nature-based solutions carbon is the majority of the investment and early project potential is often done by a combination of private entities and their local partners or NGO partners. And there isn't actually a methodological incentive to publish the work that's happening. And there isn't actually capital to enable somebody to be in charge of publishing the work that needs to be very visible. So there are some other regulatory mechanisms in place where we're able to figure out who's working where, and then it becomes a social construct. For example, if a project uses carbon as a commodity and sells it, it's required to register. We can go to public registries, see who and where. And then from there, we can make connections and hope that the project has a scientist attached to it or somebody in the philanthropy group that's responsible for being the emissary to the information and the local case study. Unless all of these things align, it's very rare that we have a compendium of case studies that we can pull from. And we are not in a mature market format where people feel confident sharing their playbooks because they treat it as intellectual property in many cases. So we're trying to crack that open in the sense that we're not necessarily a developer and we're trying to incentivize knowledge libraries, learnings, and things coming together in a centralized point that people can leverage as part of our technical assistance. And that includes a lot of groundwork, including digitizing local records, digitizing notes, interviewing stakeholders and putting this information in there, and combining that with what literature's hit the public sphere in terms of peer-reviewed work and otherwise. Really, that's an uphill battle. And I think if any of us have the ability to call for an advancement in this marketplace through regulatory mechanisms, through participants and others, it really should be playing with an open a hand of cards, if you will. We really should be playing in a much more visible manner. So that's built into our system. But again, we're not a developer, so we have less to protect and our incentives are otherwise, right?
But transparency is key. You're right to highlight that, Matthew, in order to build trust in the system that we're building.
That's a great point and a great place for us to close. And thank you, Arnaud. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, James. Thank you,
Thank you
Guillermo, for all your support. Thanks, everyone, for participating. The recording and slides will be shared in summary later. And wish you all a great rest of your day or afternoon
Thank you.
or evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much.
All the best. Take
Thank
care.
you, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.